their presence here to talk about something extremely important. Today we'll be talking about a report that recently launched at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. It's about addressing women, climate change, and security, triple nexus, in the Arab region. Today we're lucky to have 2 out of the 3 authors here with us. Dr. Sarah Shihab, she's a senior fellow senior research fellow with the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, and Shama Al-Tabal, continuing education head of section at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. The 3rd author is not with us here, Mustafa Al-Bayoumi. Again, thank you, Mustafa, for putting the report with our 3 authors. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. So Dr. Sarah Shihab, she's a senior research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. Dr. Shihab curates the Women and Diplomacy Research program at AGDA. She also trains diplomats on the women, peace, and security agenda, and contemporary global and economic affairs. She's the lead researcher and author of the annual Women in Diplomacy Index, a unique measure of women ambassadors around the world. Prior to this role, Dr. Shihab was assistant professor at Zayed University in Dubai. Dr. Shihab holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Delaware. Thank you, and welcome to the panel. Our second panelist is Ms. Shama Al-Tabal, is the head of continuing education section at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. Prior to this position, she was an instructor in the executive training department at AGDA with an academic background in international affairs and human rights. Her research interests include human rights, particularly those associated with women, children, and disabled people. She was senior researcher in the human rights sector at the Community Development Authority in Dubai, and instructor of undergraduate courses at Zayed University. Shama holds an MSc, a Master of Science in Human Rights from the University College Dublin. Welcome, Shama, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, recently we launched, or the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy launched a report on women, climate, and security, the triple nexus. We're here to discuss the impact of the gender inequality, climate change, and conflict on women in the Arab world. The report explores the strategies that the Arab countries have adopted so far to address climate and security-related risks that impact women. What are the national action plans for women, peace, and security? Do they address the risk posed by climate change? What are the initiatives that do exist, and are they suited to tackle security and climate-included impacts on women and girls? These are some of the ideas that we will discuss at this panel, and we'll try to offer several policy recommendations on how to address the triple nexus in the most vulnerable Arab countries and in the Arab region. So let's start, Dr. Sarah, with the first question. So if you can give us an overview of the triple nexus, or understand the link between women, security, and climate change. Can you give us an overview on the topic?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Sheikh Hamza, for supporting us from the beginning. Your support has been invaluable to the team at AGDA. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try to be super brief because I can go on for 30 minutes, and I see that we don't have much time. So the triple nexus is about how climate change impacts, coupled with gender inequality, coupled with conflict and conflict-related risks, how they all interconnect together and create a very devastating vicious cycle to women and girls, because we know that climate change impacts such as droughts, floods, desertification, whether it's slow onset or fast onset climate events, they impact women and girls disproportionately. So when you add into the mix displacement, gender-based violence, risks regarding women's mobility, which are also security-related risks that happen as a result of conflict. When you add that to the mix, and then you have, at the same time, pre-existing gender inequality and socioeconomic conditions in different parts of the world where women have, less access to resources, whether it's natural resources or financial resources. And so you end up in a situation where states where all of this is happening are not able to cope with climate change impacts, but it's worse for women because their adaptive capability and their ability to cope with climate change risks is actually, very hard. And that's basically keeping it very general, right? So we need to really address that, and we need to make sure that we understand the links between climate change and conflict, and we need to connect the dots in societies and communities where gender inequality is rampant, right? But I want to say one thing. We're not saying here that climate change causes conflict, and we're not saying that climate change causes gender inequality. What we're saying is that when climate change impacts happen in societies that are already at high risk of conflict and where gender inequalities are already existing, that's when it becomes super serious. And so we wanted to basically take a look at how all of these aspects are interlinked together, and to see whether or not Arab countries are addressing this in their national adaptation plans or in their national action plans for women, peace, and security. And we believe that this is obviously not a new area of research, but it's certainly new in the UAE. And so we wanted to see, what Arab countries around us are doing about this triple nexus and whether there's enough conversations about it. And I think it's very important that we're having this conversation today because it's Gender Day at COP28. And so we sort of wanted to be here to launch the report, which everyone can scan the QR code and download a copy of it. But also we wanted to talk about how, how this is important to be addressed at this COP.
Okay, great. So, if you're, I'm using a metaphor that I heard yesterday and I thought it was brilliant. So it's like you're peeling an onion, so all the combination are kind of dramatic for the gender combined with climate change, combined with security.
Exactly. So climate change is a serious threat multiplier. It's an insecurity multiplier. And taken together, it basically creates really an unsustainable situation in the most vulnerable states. And we know that the countries that are, that need to address this triple nexus the most, and I think perhaps Shema is going to tell us a little bit more about the countries where this is happening the most in our region. These are the countries that are actually not addressing this triple nexus. So
we'll explore the countries that are not addressing this triple nexus. Yeah. Shema, so Dr. Sarah mentioned the interlink or the connection between women, climate change, and security. Why is this important in this region, in the Arab region in particular? Why is it important?
Well, hello, yeah. I think that the climate security nexus has such a high risk when gender norms and gender inequality make it so that women and men go through climate change impacts differently. And why is that? Just as a pre-context, women have a different when it comes to decision-making in the household. Women have a different when it comes to access to financial assets or physical assets, when it comes to access to natural resources. So we already have a plethora of pre-existing gender inequalities. Add on top of that, climate change that increases the risk for women and creates even sometimes new problems, such as the increase of gender-based violence, such as greater poverty, lack of access to maternal health, pre- and postnatal. So you add another layer of problems. And then add to that conflict as well. So women have a difficulty already dealing or adapting or being resilient in their communities when it comes to tackling climate change impacts. And when you add another layer of conflict, that just makes it even the more difficult and increases the risk of women. Now, the topic of climate, or the nexus of climate insecurity and gender inequality, is extremely important globally. However, I think the Arab region or the Arab world has a unique set of characteristics and that make it so that this topic needs to be addressed urgently. We have countries that suffer from state fragility, we have countries that suffer from climate vulnerability and gender inequality. I mean, the region in terms of climate suffers, or sorry, the region is classified or characterized by arid and semi-arid climates. So that means it's more susceptible to things like environmental stresses and shocks like a rise in temperature, groundwater depletion, water scarcity, floods, droughts, you name it. It's a whole list of different climate change impacts. And that is why women would find it difficult to adapt, given that they do not have the proper mechanism to do so. The region also grapples with gender inequality issues. And again, that's another area of difficulty which makes coping even the more difficult. Not only that, but the region is characterized by or goes through decades or went through decades of violence and conflict, and that has caused or had detrimental effects such as displacement, forced migration, poverty, so on and so forth. So why is it important for the region is, unfortunately, the region is a hotbed for violence. It suffers from climate vulnerability, state fragility, which makes it extremely difficult for women to adapt. However, I will end with a note by saying that the region is characterized by specific social and cultural variables, and we need to keep these variables into consideration when we study the region, whether that's in terms of finding out the reasons, when we come to analyze or study the effect of climate change or gender inequality in the society, so we can be able to create context-appropriate adaptation policies.
Especially if we know that this region is particularly affected by climate change. We know that in a 1.5 degree scenario, this region in particular will be increased by 4 degrees. So the impact is greater than other regions generally when it comes to climate change.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Shama. Dr. Sarah, so how is this triple nexus linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and women, peace, and security agenda? And does this framework, or the SDG framework, address the triple nexus?
So the short answer is no.
Okay.
So
should we go to the next question?
no, I'll elaborate a little bit. But the short answer is no. The SDGs don't pay enough attention to the triple nexus, and neither does the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And that's sort of a wasted opportunity in our opinion, because I'll start with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So you have this holistic, comprehensive framework that's supposed to address all the risks that target women during conflict, and countries are supposed to develop their national action plans for women, peace, and security to say, okay, how are you going to protect women? How are you, going to prevent conflict? How are you going to do relief and recovery, which are the pillars of the WPS agenda? But out of the 105 states that actually have national action plans for women, peace, and security, only 18, so 18 out of 105, actually address climate risks as a serious risk that can actually have a serious compound effect on women's security. So not enough countries are actually acknowledging that conflict is obviously not climate change is not the root of the conflict, but it can seriously impact it. Now, in our region, because we are talking about the Arab region, only Jordan, we have 8 Arab countries actually that have national action plans for women, peace and security. And out of these 8 Arab countries, only Jordan talks about climate change and recognize this as a serious threat that can make, conflict and gender inequalities worse. But the rest actually don't. So that's something that's not really addressed yet. And then, sorry, because you also asked about the SDGs.
Correct. So how is it linked to the SDGs?
So
because
again,
all countries, they have SDG frameworks,
exactly,
and then they follow their goals.
So the SDGs, we have a lot of SDGs. Obviously, SDG 5 is about gender equality, but you also have a lot of other SDGs that target climate. And when you look at the SDGs that target climate and food security and, how are we going to sustainably use our oceans and our resources, then when you sort of dig through their data, what we discovered when we were putting this report together is that there's no gender disaggregated data. So there's no way for us or for states to be able to tell how are these climate-related SDGs actually, assessing the impact of all of this on women. And that's another thing that we basically, that's when we realized that, we have these 2 comprehensive frameworks that are accepted, adopted, but when we're talking about the WPS agenda, it's not really recognizing climate change as a risk. And when we're talking about the SDGs, it's not really focusing on gender that much in the climate-related SDGs. Yeah. And so for us, that triple nexus remains unaddressed when we look at both frameworks.
So globally, there's 18 countries that address women, peace, and security.
No, there's 105 countries that have national action plans for women, peace, and security, but out of those 105, 18 address climate change as a risk.
And out of those 18, only 1 country in this region?
Yes, Jordan.
Jordan.
Yes.
And then the SDG framework, they're like working in silos. They're not linked to...
Exactly, and they're not basically using gender disaggregated data when it comes to the climate-related SDGs.
So if we look at the women, peace, and security triple nexus, Shama, what's the impact of this triple nexus on countries here in the region? I think in the report you addressed 2 countries, Syria and Yemen. How is that triple nexus impacting women?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the region is, or many countries in the region suffer from state fragility, climate vulnerability, and gender inequality. And it is important to address these issues in order to ensure sustainable development policies, in order to ensure social equity, and in order to ensure climate resilience in these communities. Now, specifically talking or taking the examples of Syria and Yemen, according to the Georgetown Institute Index for WPS, both Syria and Yemen rank amongst the lowest in this index. And not only that, but in other indices such as the Gender Inequality Index and the State Fragility Index, both Yemen and Syria rank amongst the lowest in both of the indices that I've mentioned. So why is this important, and how does it affect countries such as Syria and Yemen? Let's take, for example, the issue of agriculture. Now, in many instances in these communities, men leave rural communities and try to pursue non-farming careers, leaving the farming or agriculture to women in addition to household responsibilities as well. So, for example, just to give you some numbers, agriculture-related female employment in the Arab countries was 23%, yet women only own 10% of arable land. So that in itself does affect women's ability to self-sustain or sustain their families as well. So not only is there a lack in land ownership, but there's also a lack in access to information and access to resources in order to increase crop yields. And that's also another issue that we need to address as well. Now, in Yemen, for example, agriculture plays a very important role in the livelihood of these families. As I mentioned, many of men leave these communities or leave their families for non-farming careers. So women, for example, 46% of women in Yemen engage in agriculture, whereas only 27% of men engage in agricultural activities in Yemen as a source of income, as a source of livelihood. So, unfortunately, one of the effects or impacts of climate change is groundwater depletion. Now, it is expected that the effects of the groundwater depletion in Yemen will decrease crop yields by 40%. Can you imagine? 46% of women work in agriculture, yet the crop yields would decrease by 40%. So can you imagine the impacts of that on the livelihoods of these families, of these communities that depend on agriculture as the main source of income? Now let's take Syria, for example, quickly as another example. In northeast Syria, it's suffering the worst drought it has in the past 70 years, and add to that a layer of conflict for over a decade. Again, a huge impact on the livelihood of these communities or the families, specifically women that depend on agriculture. Food security. Food security is yet another issue, another example where women, unfortunately, bear the larger burden in this picture. Again, just to throw a few numbers, it is expected that in the MENA region as a whole, around 21 million women are expected to be food insecure by 2050 versus 12% of men in the region. So unfortunately, women do bear the larger burden of food insecurity. That happens in Yemen, that happens in Syria, and that happens in other communities across the world. So although women play a very important role in the agri-food system, okay, they still lack access to food. Okay, so it's not about, sometimes it's not a matter of availability, it's a matter of accessibility. And if I may just add one more last point, malnutrition is a huge, huge, huge issue in these war-torn or conflict-prone areas, because especially for lactating mothers, for pregnant women, in Yemen alone and in Syria, they're one of the top 10 hunger spots in the world. So can you imagine the impacts of that? It causes things like stunt births, it causes things like miscarriages, and sometimes even deaths for these women. So they do carry that burden, unfortunately, and these are some of the impacts. I mean, the paper discusses it in more details, but these are just a brief idea of the impacts of conflict and climate change on these communities and specifically on women.
And this region is already water scarce. I mean, 11 out of the 17 most water scarce countries in the world, they're in this region, in the Arab region. So you can just imagine that impact already on the agriculture and the women in agriculture field. So those are the issues that you've seen and you mentioned in the report. So what other countries in the region are doing to address, what kind of initiatives do we see, Dr. Sarah, in this region that countries are driving to address this triple nexus? Is there something positive or there's none?
I don't want to answer this question again by saying no.
Because
no.
honestly, I mean, when I reviewed the paper and I read the paper and I went online and tried to see some initiatives, I couldn't find many. Almost none.
Exactly, and this is the problem that we have when we were we were writing the paper. We were trying to discuss, okay, so we know that there's a problem, now let's look at some of the solutions. We wanted to look at women-led climate adaptation initiatives in the Arab world. And then I remember very well speaking to Shamma and Mustafa and telling them, guys, I can't find anything on Syria. And that's when we asked you, like, Joe, do you have anything on Syria? And you're like, no. And then we tried to look into what's happening in Yemen, and we found 2 projects that are trying to empower Yemeni women to actually fight water scarcity and to sort of, strengthen their role in water-related conflicts. But apart from that, and apart from these couple of projects happening in Yemen, we couldn't find that much happening there or in Syria. And I think the three of us tried, and I know you tried as well. So
I mean, we saw initiatives, but they're not really gender-based, right?
exactly. So there's a lot going on in the climate space, but when it comes to address the initiatives that address this triple nexus, it's quasi-absent, right? And as I said at the beginning, so there's a lot happening in the climate space in the region, but we were very specific about, looking at women-led climate adaptation measures that actually look at this triple nexus, and we couldn't really find anything. Now, I just want to say something positive because I don't want to sound so pessimistic all the time. But when we looked at national adaptation plans for the countries around the region, we were very pleased to see, for example, that Jordan, again, comes out as an example, but also Kuwait and Palestine have actually addressed gender and several gender considerations and gender disaggregated data in their national adaptation plan. So this was something of a positive step, but that's also, not widespread across the region. That's just 3 Arab countries, and it's also not the case that Syria and Yemen have done that. So again, the countries that are the most vulnerable to this triple nexus, such as Syria, such as Yemen, such as Libya, are the ones that still have not included gender in their national adaptation plans. And then when you look at the sort of initiatives that they're doing on the ground, they're a bit ad hoc, they're not comprehensive enough, they haven't been truly institutionalized, and certainly they don't reach women in the most vulnerable areas. And so, yeah, I mean, to basically answer your question in a sort of briefer way, there's not much going on in that space at the moment.
And it's not a framework that you can copy from anywhere and then
no, we have
put it in your
examples.
national
No,
plan.
we do have examples. I think there's a lot that's being done in a lot of African countries that you can look at and sort of benchmark against and take as sort of your lead examples. So there are projects around the world that are happening that have proven to be successful that we could adapt and copy.
They could be adapted to this region.
Exactly, but we haven't done that yet, unfortunately.
Okay, so there isn't many initiatives here in this region, but there's some national plans that could be kind of adapted. Shama, given that we're sitting here at COP28 and this is COP of action, or we're supposed to deliver something, is there something that you highlighted in the report that any recommendations that we can give that we can, probably drive policy so we can drive this triple nexus national plans to address this women, climate, and security? Is there something that we can call for?
Absolutely. Considering the time we have left, I'm just going to keep this brief and simple. In sum, I think it's important to include climate change risks in national adaptation plans for women, peace, and security were one of the recommendations that we came up with. Of course, only 8 Arab countries, as Sarah mentioned, have WPS, Women, Peace and Security, national action plans. However, looking at the cup half full, countries who still don't have national action plans for WPS still have a space or a leeway to include climate risks for women in these action plans. That's one. Second, I think including the triple nexus within NDCs and national action plans is extremely important as well. Even though several countries do have gender in their NDCs, only 4 of them actually have climate change NAPs. So that's also something to mention as well, specifically when targeting or discussing vulnerable groups in the Arab world and in the Arab region. Another thing is, I think Sarah mentioned that in one of her answers, talking about sex disaggregated data. It's important to collect data, it's important to monitor these communities in order to study them, in order to come up with appropriate adaptation policies. It's not one size fits all, and it's important to collect data and do these studies to be able to identify what needs to be done. Another thing is agricultural reforms. As I've mentioned, agriculture is a very important factor in these communities, and reform needs to be done in terms of women's land ownership, in terms of tenure rights for women, which would probably elevate and ease their adaptation to climate change issues. And finally, I will just sort of leave with a sentence that using platforms such as COP and other international platforms are extremely important to empower women, to encourage women to be part of the problem solving. We are not just victims, as Her Highness Sheikh Hamoza mentioned. Women are not victims. They are important players. They are important actors of change. So they need to be included in creating appropriate adaptation policies.
Absolutely. I mean, you couldn't finish it, but like that's the best conclusion ever for this panel. Thank you. Thank you, Shama. Thank you, Dr. Azhara. So we have a couple of minutes. We might take a couple of questions if we have a couple of questions. So I'll give you the microphone and you can ask the questions.
So I just first want to thank you for this interactive panel. You had already addressed very important nexus in here. I just want to add to one of the points that you had mentioned related to the NABA programs. I just want to tell you that, or to share with you, that we are going to have a special event here in our pavilion about launching the UAE NAB roadmap. That will be on the 6th of December. So we are already developing this NAB roadmap. The National Adaptation Program in UAE, it is already developed, and we had developed a roadmap for that. You are more than welcome to attend our event here on the 6th of December at 3:25 p.m. In addition to that,
will it include gender
yes,
considerations? Okay,
gender,
great.
yeah, gender has been already included in that roadmap, and you are more than welcome to come and to know more details about that roadmap. And the whole program will be launched by 2024. So we will have it addressed, and it's already in place. Just
Excellent.
that I want to
Great
share with you.
news.
Great news.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you for the remarks.
Our
I think
work
it's
is done.
brilliant.
Yeah.
So for the second version of the report, we're
We
going to
are so
include the UAE.
influential that they adopted our solution like right away.
Yeah, just we want to remember the statement